There are many people that I consider ambassadors of narrative and specialists of narrative who really understand the value, but there's few that understand the value that storytelling means as much to the story listener as the storyteller. It's a co-constructive art. It's an interactive medium. And today we have a colleague, a friend, a specialist in narrative, and I would say a wonderful storyteller as well as story listener, Dr. Amy Shuman.
So it's tempting to just want to come and tell you stories, and I have favorite stories. The main message I want to say, that I want to talk to you about just for a few minutes, is that I think that for everything that stories do, or that we might say that they do, they probably also do the opposite. And so I was going to give you just a couple of examples of that. One of the things I've been particularly interested in is what I call small world stories, or coincidences. I've been collecting dozens and dozens of these, of stories of people finding other people in places they don't expect. My favorite one, which is too long to tell, but I can't resist kind of giving you the eclipsed version of it, is another folklorist who was invited to, he runs a museum, and he was invited by one of the members of the board to take him on a trip to Australia, because he had gone to Australia and was telling all about his trip, and this very wealthy man said, "I'd like to go." And so one day he called up and he said, "Now is the time, I'm going to take you to Australia, meet me on Saturday night in Palm Springs." So this is from Wyoming. You know, the guy really going to be there. Anyway, he goes to Palm Springs and they take off, much longer story. And they end up, they've taken off very late, and they take off, so they decided they couldn't go. Oh, I forgot the most important part of the story. So he's deciding he has to go, and Saturday morning, the day he's going to go, he gets a call that someone is selling a cowboy piano, and he collects cowboy pianos. And he's just got to see this piano. So he goes and he sees this cowboy piano, which is a piano made out of a horn of an animal, hold the keyboard. It's a cowboy piano because the cowboys probably would find this horn from a dead animal and then make a keyboard out of it and then make it into a piano. So he's got to have this piano. So he says to the owner of it, "I just have to have this piano, but I'm leaving tonight to go to Palm Springs. Is there any way that you could hold it for me for 2 weeks? Because he's going to Australia after Palm Springs." And the woman says yes, and so he goes to, so he gives her the money and leaves the piano in her house, and then he goes to Palm Springs, and it takes a long time for them to get going out of Palm Springs. And as they're flying, the pilot says, it's a private plane, the pilot says, "You know, we really shouldn't fly the whole way. We should stop in Fiji. There's a nice hotel. We need to get some rest before we fly the rest of the way." So they stop in Fiji. And as and when they're in Fiji, they're passing by a little museum in Fiji that's to the American soldiers who fought in World War II. And this guy says that his brother fought in World War II and was in the South Pacific and really wants to see this museum. Tell his brother that. So they go to the museum, and while the guy's looking around, the folklorist is talking to the woman who's running the museum. And she's an American, not surprisingly, but she comes from the same place that he does, from Wyoming. And he says, "Well, what brought you here?" And she's telling him that, you know, about how she ended up in Fiji. And he says, "Well, do you think you'll ever go back to Wyoming? You know, is there any chance you'll go back?" And she says, "Not anymore." She says, "Yesterday my mother sold my piano." So here he meets this person who is the owner of the piano in Fiji, right? So that's one of my favorite stories. But I collect all kinds of these stories, and then I was thinking about, so what's the opposite of this kind of story? What's the opposite of this coincidence story? We tell so many of these, and it fits into so many of the categories that I want to just briefly mention about storytelling. And the opposite is that we live in a world where people are separated from each other by all kinds of things. They're separated by wars, they're separated by disasters, they're separated by just misfortune. And for some people, it would be a great miracle to find their lost loved ones. So while I was collecting these small world stories, I started collecting what I would consider to be their opposite. And one of the stories, just the quickest one I can tell you, is about a woman whose family was American, but decided to go on a trip to visit their relatives right at the very beginning of World War II. It's a Jewish family. And they went to Germany, and they visited their family, and then they went to Poland, and then the war broke out, and they came back to the United States. And they got a message that the family in Germany had put their two little twin girls, baby girls, maybe 3 or 4 months old, on a bus. And then they were killed. The parents were killed in the Holocaust. And she said they've done everything to try to find these little girls who they assume were adopted by someone. They were blonde, blue-eyed, they could easily pass as German, they're probably still living. But they've never found the 2 little baby girls. So that's just an example of, for every kind of story, there's another. For everything that stories do, there's something else that they do. So just to extend that for just a little bit, another thing I'm interested in is who owns the story? Who does it belong to? Kevin has just said that he's open with a story about, if you keep it, it's wasted, it's ruined. You have to send it out. And I think that both things are true. I think it's both true that your story, the things that happen to you, the things that you've suffered especially, are your story and they're yours to tell. And at the same time, sometimes you don't even know what happened to you, and you need other people to tell you what happened to you. Sometimes, actually, another sad part is that if you're the victim of some kind of oppression, the oppressors know more about what happened to you than you know about what happened to you. You have to rely on their stories to reconstruct what happened to you. So we own our stories, but we don't. And also, I believe that although there's very strict rules, I studied junior high school kids, I really know these rules, about never telling anyone's story to anyone else ever. Of course, that's what they did every day, every minute. That although it is your story, stories were meant, as Kevin said, to travel. The next thing, and I have 3 things, don't worry. The second thing is that we say that stories help us make sense out of life. And I think the opposite is also true, that sometimes we can't even find the stories to make sense out of something. So I think stories do both. They help us make sense out of our experiences, and they also don't. They fail us. And the last one is that stories are records of things that we don't want to forget. So, and there are wonderful stories about this, about people sending on the storyteller. You know, the only person who's going to survive is the storyteller. Or sometimes we don't remember how to do a particular kind of ritual or have a kind of experience, but we know how to talk about it. So stories are records of things we don't want to forget. They're reminders sometimes of things that we've already forgotten. That is, the story can remind us that we have forgotten things. And then also one last thing, I said there would be 2, but of course there has to be 1 more. And the last one is that sometimes stories travel well, and sometimes they don't travel well. And that totally fascinates me. So one of the things I like to do with my students is try to get at that edge, all these edges of where stories are reminders, where stories are about forgetting, where stories make meaning, where they don't make meaning, where they travel. And we all know a story is told and everybody knows what it felt like or what it meant, or you get an example of a story that doesn't work, and I'll close with a quick example of that. So in my family, we have a story about how these neighbors of my grandparents, these 2 young men who didn't like each other in junior high school, and both thought of the other as, we're Jewish, so our word is a nevish, so somebody who does not know mountain. So these 2 boys were both nevishes, according to everybody else, and they also thought each other were nevishes. So they ended up in Kuwait as ambassadors diplomats of great importance. And they looked familiar to each other, and they said, oh, you know, who are you? And they figured out who they were, and it became a family story that they came to Kuwait. So the Jewish story is that people who everyone thought wouldn't amount to much did amount to a lot. And when I told it to my Argentine friend, Ana Cara, she said, oh, we would tell the same sort of story, except the ending would be, how did you fool them? instead of doing the math too much. So that's an example of the contract. Thanks for letting me